Hey guys, so today I'm going to be talking about Tiananmen Square, and I'm going to be talking about what Tiananmen Square is, the history behind it, famous events that have taken place, and lastly I'm going to be talking a few miscellaneous facts that some of you may or may not know. So hopefully you guys enjoy. So firstly, Tiananmen Square is a city square in the center of Beijing, named after the Tiananmen Gate located north of it, which separates it from the Forbidden City. It is one of the biggest tourist attractions in the world and contains many famous buildings, including the National Museum of China and the Great Hall of the People that were erected to commemorate the PRC's 10th anniversary. At 109 acres, it is one of the world's biggest city squares. Moving on to its history, the Tiananmen stands for Gate of Heavenly Peace, which was a gate in the wall of the imperial city, built in 1415 during the Ming Dynasty. Tiananmen Square was designed and built in 1651, having been destroyed in the 17th century by fighting, and has since been enlarged by 4 times its original size in the 1950s. The Great Ming Gate was the southern gate to the imperial city and stood near the square center. It was renamed Gate of China during the Republican era. This gate was purely ceremonial and was normally closed unless the emperor had to pass through. As a result, it diverted commoner traffic to the side gates. In 1860, the legation quarter was an area that was built to the east of the square. This was because during the Second Opium War, British and French troops invaded Beijing and shortly considered burning down the gate and the Forbidden City. However, they later chose to spare the Forbidden City, instead burning down the old Summer Palace. Xianfeng Emperor later agreed to let them barrack troops and later establish diplomatic missions, which led to this area being developed. After the Boxer Rebellion ended, the legation quarter became an area for a space that the foreign powers could use to assemble military forces. The Gate of China was demolished in 1954, allowing the square to be enlarged further. Following Mao's vision to make the square the largest in the world, a major year-long expansion of Tiananmen Square started in 1958. As a result of this process, a number of other buildings were demolished. In 1976, a year after Mao's death, the mausoleum of Mao Zedong was built on the square. The Tiananmen Square has also been the location of a number of famous events, and perhaps the most infamous one is the Tiananmen Square Massacre. It was an armed suppression of a pro-democracy movement that took place on June 4, 1989. The death toll is estimated to be in the thousands, though the true number is unknown. The main stimulus of the massacre was the political and economic changes implemented by Deng Xiaoping in 1989, after his appointment as chairman of the PRC. He began to convert China into a market economy, much to the chagrin of many people. In May 1989, nearly 1 million Chinese people, consisting of young students and industrial workers, crowded into central Beijing to protest for greater democracy, calling for the resignation of multiple Chinese Communist Party leaders who were viewed to be too repressive. The protesters marched and chanted for almost 3 weeks, and Western reporters captured a lot of the drama for television and newspaper audiences. Shortly before the massacre, the protesters erected a goddess of democracy out of plaster and styrofoam as a symbolic monument to the protest. This monument was intended to be as large as possible so that authorities would have trouble taking it down. If they tried to take it down, the government would also fuel further hatred. The Chinese government actually tried to negotiate with the students, asking them to stop protesting, but their efforts were fruitless. Thus, the party leaders had to resort to force. By late May, top party leaders, now believing that the protesters were to be seen as terrorists and counter-revolutionaries, agreed that martial law had to be used to restore order. Martial law is when the government calls the military forces, in this case the People's Liberation Army, to bring an event to a halt. However, the troops were blocked off by the thousands of protests that were held in the city. After multiple days with no signs of the protests coming to an end, the military was again sent in on June 3rd, with Deng Xiaoping giving orders to put down the rebellion by any means. On June 4th, the People's Liberation Army sent soldiers and tanks from the 27th and the 38th Armies, and the word spread that hundreds of thousands of troops were advancing from all directions. Panic broke out, and the protesters tried to flood the streets in order to block the oncoming troops. In response, the army began to fire randomly into the crowds of protesters. Commotion resulted as thousands of young students tried to flee. Despite this, other protesters fought back by stoning the troops and overturning military vehicles. Along with the death toll, reports estimated that as many as 10,000 people were arrested. An interesting story that occurred during the massacre was the legend of the Tank Man. According to footage shown on television, a skinny man holding grocery bags stepped in front of the convoy of tanks that led eastward into Tiananmen. He swung his grocery bags, beckoning the tanks to leave, but they did not move. After a short standoff, the so-called Tank Man climbed into the leading tank. He appeared to be trying to talk to the men driving the tank, but he was later dragged away. Though his fate remains unknown, the Tank Man later became a hero and a legend, after his picture was smuggled out of China and appeared on newspapers worldwide. During military action, all international television networks were ordered to stop broadcasting footage of the massacre. The government even shut down satellite transmission. Also, the police were very strict with cameras, telling anybody recording to stop immediately. Even when the massacre ended, other protests were held in Shanghai and Guangzhou. In Hong Kong, people wore black in conjunction with the protesters in Beijing. The Tiananmen Square protests led to fears in Hong Kong that the PRC would follow up on its commitments under the one country, two systems principle, following the impending handover in 1997. In response, the governor of the PRC, Chris Patten, attempted to expand the franchise for Electrico, leading to friction with Beijing. To this day, there have been large candlelight vigils in Hong Kong that are attended by thousands every year. The savagery of the Chinese government's attack shocked both its allies and Cold War enemies. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev declared that the event saddened him, and he even hoped that the government would adopt his domestic reform program by democratizing the Chinese political system. In the United States, multiple Congress members denounced the Tiananmen Square massacre and wanted President George Bush to punish the Chinese government. About 3 weeks later, the US Congress voted to impose economic sanctions against the PRC in response to the brutal violation of human rights. Regardless, some countries, including North Korea and Cuba, supported the government's actions and condemned the protests. China's economy also felt the impact of the massacre. For instance, foreign loans to China and tourism revenue were reduced. Not to mention, China's international image was greatly damaged, as the images that broke out of China had strongly shaped the views of Westerners and policies towards China in later years. There have been similar incidents in Tiananmen Square, though none of them were as severe as this one. For instance, the Tiananmen incident was a similar, smaller-scale crackdown on protesters in April 1976 that was prompted by the death of Zhou Enlai. It sparked anger and led to a reshuffling of the nation's leadership. Finally, there are a number of interesting facts about Tiananmen Square. Firstly, on the 1st of October 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the founding of the PRC in the square. The square is also located in the center of the city and can be accessed today by the Beijing subway and the city bus. Next, even though the square is normally open to the public, it is under heavy security and tourists and visitors will have their belongings searched. Lastly, there are many fire extinguishers located in the square to put out flames, just in case a protester attempts self-immolation, which is the act of setting oneself on fire. That concludes this presentation. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and learned a lot about Tiananmen Square.